To further discussion and analysis of U.S. foreign policy, the Institute of International Studies, with the support of the Dean of International and Area Studies and Chancellor Robert Berdahl, is sponsoring a series of public events in the fall and spring semesters, and we're calling them the Empire Dialogues. Focusing on U.S. power and world order, these forums, lectures, and panels will examine such questions as the following, which is not to say that these questions will be answered necessarily, or all of them, at each panel. The questions we proposed were the following. How can history inform a discussion of U.S. policy? What useful comparisons can be made with the experience of other great powers? In this context, how should U.S. responsibilities be defined? How can the U.S. fulfill its role without compromising its traditions and values? What are the implications of U.S. choices for world order and international justice? So, throughout the spring semester, we will be bringing people, either panels or lectures, to address these questions, or maybe one question at a particular session. The website for these events, which is rather important because participants often wind up not being able to come at the last minute. The website is globetrotter.berkeley.edu. No W. www, just globetrotter.berkeley.edu. That may have political significance, but it's actually the way we create our domains on the campus. So go to that site, and you will find either the change of place or the change of speaker. And I should note that at the last minute, Daniel Ellsberg had to go to Washington, and he deeply regretted not being able to be with us, but he expressed best wishes. And I do, before I even introduce him, I'm going to thank Professor Jerry Saunders of Peace and Conflict Studies for at the last minute agreeing to participate in our program. So for future events, we have acceptances from Brian Urquhart, who was the Undersecretary General of the UN, Anto Levin of the Financial Times, Jessica Stern of Harvard, and David Harvey of the City College of New York, among others, people who will be coming. So go to the website and look at the university calendar for future events. We're calling today's dialogue The Lessons of History, The Limits of Power. And we're very pleased to welcome three individuals who will speak each for 20 minutes, and then we will have a discussion among them, and then we will open the floor to questions. When we do the questions, we will use these mics, but we'll just get two people up at a time, and we are going to end this session at 9, so if you get to ask a question, just make it short, because you're cutting into the time of people who are to follow. Our panelists today are Ruth Rosen, who is Professor Emerita of History at UC Davis and a columnist and editorial writer at the San Francisco Chronicle. Her publications include The World Split Open, How the Modern Women's Movement Changed America. Jerry Saunders is a professor in the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies on the campus, and his publications include The Peddlers of Crisis, The Committee on the Present Danger, and The Politics of Containment. Very relevant history, I must say. And then finally, we're very pleased to welcome from London Tariq Ali, who flew all day today to be here with us this evening. He's a distinguished writer, broadcaster, and filmmaker, and a major figure in the European New Left. He is an editor of the New Left Review, a prolific author. He's written many books, and his most recent one is Bush in Babylon, the Recolonization of Iraq, and that will be available actually at the door when you leave. Cody's will be selling copies, and we'll make time for him to sign them. So with that introduction, I'll begin our panel and welcome Ruth to the podium.
Good evening. Just for the record, I'd like to say that the very first new word I learned as a college freshman was hubris. Think about that for a moment, because it's what I want to address tonight. Every year, Sonoma State University, which has a project called Project Censored, releases a list of the most unreported stories that the media has failed to publicize. I don't always agree with their list, but for the years 2002 and 2003, Project Censored has chosen the neoconservative plan for global domination as the top underreported story. And in this case, I couldn't agree more. You can't build and sustain an empire unless you impose it and then defend it with superior military power. And I want to say that this didn't begin under the Bush administration. As a historian, I feel compelled to remind all of us that a core circle of future members of the Bush administration conceived the ideas of preemptive war and American global domination during the 1990s, well before they held positions of power. Now, they're called neoconservatives because many of them were initially influenced by Trotsky's idea of permanent revolution. And then they moved to the far right. Not all of them, but a good core of them. They include, for example, Paul Wolfowitz, who's the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Douglas Feith, number 3 at the Pentagon, Louis Libby, Cheney's Chief of Staff, James Bolton, a right-winger assigned to the State Department to keep his eye out on Secretary of State Colin Powell, and Elliot Abrams, who heads the Middle East policy at the National Security Council. Outside of the government, those are the people who are in the government. Outside of the government, they include Richard Pearl, who just resigned his chairmanship of the Defense Policy Advisory Body, and James Woolsey, who's a former CIA advisor, and who has repeatedly tried to link both 9/11 and the anthrax letters to Saddam Hussein. These neocons are real ideologues whose opinions have filled William Kristol's Weekly Standard for years. But it was in the 1990s they came together in a conservative think tank that's called the Project for the New American Century, which is run by Kristol. And they published a series of letters and documents which are readily available on the web, and some of you may have heard about this before. And what they did is they called for American supremacy, for preventive war, preemptive war, and they called for the United States to invade and to occupy Iraq. And this was well before Bush even imagined he would run for the presidency. Their luck, and Newsweek has had an interesting article about this week, their luck was to have Vice President Cheney, who agreed with their aims, and a very inexperienced and, we might say, thinly educated president who doesn't read newspapers and who depends on others to filter his sense of reality. Now, this story that I've just said about how these neoconservatives created these ideas in this think tank is not new, and it's been written about quite a bit in the American press for those of us who read that kind of thing. I don't think most America knows this. But what I want to talk about tonight is something that's not been so publicized, which contributes to the idea of global domination and implements it. And that is Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, who brought his own vision of global domination to the Bush administration, but from a different venue, from the venue of the United States Air Force Space Command. If you think about his vision, you could think, as I'm describing it, that I'm wacko. Because the first time I looked at the United States Space Command website in 2001, I had just left the University of California as a full professor of history. I'd become an editorial writer and not quite yet a full-time columnist. And I went to my editor and I showed him these pictures. And I said, now you know I'm a serious scholar. And he looked at these things, and he trusted me. These things were on the web because they were proud of them. These were American documents describing how global domination would take place. What they imagined was space-based weapons orbiting the globe, ready to zap or nuke any country that was declared an imminent threat by the United States and to the United States. Before President Bush even tapped Donald Rumsfeld to head the Pentagon, Rumsfeld was chair of a very obscure commission that most Americans did not hear about. It was called the Commission to Assess United States National Security Management Organization. He finished the report in December 2000, and just as Bush took office, he submitted it to the Congress, which no journalist bothered to report. On January 11th, 2001, I happened to find out about this report and looked at it. The report began by warning that if the United States is to avoid a space Pearl Harbor, it needs to take seriously the possibility of an attack on U.S. space systems. Now, what did they mean? They had an image of space assets which had nuclear-tipped, laser-tipped weapons that were constantly orbiting outer space, and these had to be protected from any other country that might dare to gain a foothold in space and zap these weapons. And this would be a Pearl Harbor. The report also called for a number of things. It recommended the creation of a United States Space Corps, which would be directly under the President, situated in the White House, not under the control of the Pentagon. And that this Space Corps would defend space-based military capability of the United States. In other words, while politicians around this country were debating should we have a national missile defense, what Rumsfeld was arguing is that the President needed to make space his national security priority, that there needed to be a space advisory group that would report directly to the President, and that the Air Force would create, and these are his words, a Space Corps that would eventually morph into a military department for space. Now, with these steps, the Rumsfeld Commission, which again was not publicized, and to my knowledge, I've never seen it anywhere except in one editorial I wrote in the Chronicle, which my wonderful boss let me write. With these steps, the Rumsfeld Commission felt certain that the United States would gain, and these are the language, the capability to use space as an integral part of its ability to manage crises, deter conflict, and if deterrence fails, to prevail in conflict. In short, Rumsfeld was arguing we needed a space-based weaponry to protect our assets in space and from which we could dominate the globe. Now, Rumsfeld's report was actually a tamer and quite a toned-down version of a much more ominous document which I had found earlier on the United States Space Command's website, which was located in Colorado. This document was called at the time, and this website doesn't exist anymore because it's been subsumed by the command in Nebraska. It was called Vision for 2020. And this is what it showed. It was an astonishing vision. It showed laser weapons shooting deadly beams down at different parts of the globe, zapping targets on Earth. And beneath this sci-fi image crawled the words right underneath. They just kept crawling back and over again. U.S. Space Command dominating the space dimension of military operations to protect U.S. interests and U.S. investments around the globe. When I first thought this, I thought this was a parody of Marxists. I couldn't believe that this was actually a federal document called the Department of Defense and asked if I had gotten the right URL. Vision 2020 accurately predicted that the global economy would widen the gulf between, as they called it, the haves and the have-nots. And by deploying space-based surveillance and weaponry, the United States would be able to control these conflicts, this is their language, to control space, and from this high ground, and every soldier knows you want to have the high ground when you're in battle, to dominate the earth below. Now, candidate Bush never hid his enthusiasm for leapfrogging over the next generation of weapons. In fact, in many speeches while he was running, he said he wanted to move directly to high-tech space-based weaponry. So by choosing Donald Rumsfeld, Bush appointed a man whom the Washington Post described as the leading proponent not only of a national missile defense, which is what people were debating at the time, but also of U.S. efforts to take complete control of outer space. Now, some of you will probably remember that in September 2002, it's not that far away, the Bush administration released the National Security Strategy, which was a fundamentally new foreign policy that emphasized unilateralism, American global supremacy, and preemptive war. Yet even as we continue to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan, the plan to dominate space continues and accelerates. The U.S. Space Command just released a progress report on how it's doing. It's called the Strategic Master Plan for the year 2004 and beyond. In short, it's called the SMP, Strategic Master Plan. And what it clearly describes is the United States' intention to dominate the world by turning space into the next crucial battlefield. In the introduction to this document, General Lance W. Lord very proudly writes, "As guardian of the high frontier, Air Force Space Command has the vision and the people to ensure the United States achieves space superiority today and in the future. A new Space Corps will fight in and through space." Then the document goes on, and this is their language. "Space is the ultimate high ground of military operations. Today, control of this high ground means superiority. And tomorrow, ownership of space may mean instant engagement anywhere in the world. Our vision calls for prompt global strike systems with the capability to directly apply force from or through space against terrestrial targets. Space superiority is essential to our vision of controlling and fully exploiting space to provide our military with an asymmetric advantage over our adversaries. Asymmetric advantage over our adversaries. The immediate goal, of course, is to prevent, as it describes in this progress report, anyone else from having a foothold or any entrance into outer space. Because to dominate the globe, this progress report says, the United States has to have complete control of outer space or its weapons would be neutralized. Rumsfeld's vision is, to me, extremely dangerous. For starters, many of you may not know, but the United States initiated, and it passed, a little-known treaty called the Outer Space Treaty in 1967, which wisely prohibited the militarization of space. In 2001, 163 countries reaffirmed that treaty. 3 nations abstained and refused to support the resolution. Can you guess who they were? The United States, Israel, and Micronesia. Clearly, this space-based vision is pretty useless against terrorist attacks in Afghanistan or Iraq or anywhere else in the world where people are sniping or using suicide bombers. China is the target, and China knows it is the target. It believes it is the unnamed enemy who has to be controlled from space. Last September, just a few months ago, the United Nations Conference on Disarmament in Geneva failed to reach an agreement to prevent an arms race in outer space, another story that was not reported very much, if at all. The Bush administration, as usual, insisted that an international treaty was totally unnecessary. China fought very hard for this. They really wanted to prevent an arms race in space because they're way behind. I can only imagine what Donald Rumsfeld felt in his bones the day that China sent a man into space. And they're very concerned, the Chinese government is very concerned about the Bush administration's newly articulated policy of preemptive war and permanent global supremacy, because ultimately it sees itself as the target of that policy. It's also a terribly dangerous policy because it threatens to start a completely new arms race, this time in space. I won't even go into the impact of radiation in space and the health risks involved in that. It is also hugely expensive and will cost hundreds of billions of dollars to develop and to deploy new exotic weapons in space. And these weapons, I'll forbear describing them to you, but they are exotic. They are laser-tipped, they are nuclear weapons, they are meant to be able to pinpoint nuclear-tipped and laser weapons within a very small area of space. And some of them would actually land on the Earth, some of them would operate from outer space. Most Americans seem to be unaware that the Department of Defense is constantly handing out multi-million-dollar contracts to contract for the research and development of all these exotic space-based weapons. When I wrote that first editorial in 2001, I thought, oh, this is such an incredible story. Surely other people will pick it up and they'll write about the space-based weapons. And I called it Arming the Heavens. So I'm still looking up at the heavens, and the question I have is, do we really want to leave future generations a legacy of space-based warfare? We're coming very close to actually imagining and then implementing a true Star Wars. If not, it seems to me that one thing we should be doing, those of us who can vote and who live in the United States, is to pressure every single Democratic candidate to address this issue, as well as George W. Bush. Because we need to keep the heavens free of space-based weapons. Because to control space is to ensure the domination of an American empire. Thank you.
Well, that was certainly a chilling account. One of many when we talk about the neocons in Washington. In 1971, Daniel Ellsberg was called the most dangerous man in America by none other than Henry Kissinger. I cannot claim anything on my resume even close to that. So my apologies for those of you who came to see Dan. I suppose my only defense is I'm a friend of his. So I'll convey your feelings to him. So, in thinking about this subject for tonight, lessons of history and limits of power, it seems to me that the historical record is quite clear on the subject. There's a considerable body of research which tells us the strategy of empire is habitually self-defeating. The problem for hegemonic powers is that they invariably exhaust themselves with ever-escalating attempts to maintain their primacy. Meanwhile, new powers arise who see it in their interest to counterbalance against the dominant power. This only increases the cost of empire as the hegemon is left to battle alone against the growing resistance to its pretensions. Finally, the empire collapses under the weight of its own hubris and in the mistaken belief that it somehow is different than those imperial powers who have gone before and gone down to defeat, and therefore that they will not suffer the same fate. Nothing proves further from the truth than this self-delusion. Now, despite the writing on the wall, each imperial power, of course, believes it brings its own national vanities to the challenge, so it believes that it indeed is the exception to the rule, spinning national myths that will somehow provide the magic immunity from history's verdict. In the American case, for example, the current fashion, at least the fashion in the neoconservative salons in Washington that set the tone for the Bush administration and the Republican Congress, is that the United States represents something new in the world that's variously described as benign empire, democratic imperialism, an empire of liberty. And in the neocon worldview, the unprecedented power of the United States today, unseen since the days of the Roman Empire, once it's harnessed to democracy and freedom, is an unbeatable combination that will defy the odds that we've seen from empires in the past. Not only is this the neoconservative worldview, but as Ruth has pointed out, it's the national security strategy of 2002. It is our national security doctrine. Now, of course, anyone with a cursory knowledge of American history will be quick to note that empire is not exactly new in the American experience, and Ruth alluded to that as well. William Appleman Williams, many years ago, chose as his title for his Chronicle of U.S. History, Empire as a Way of Life. But what is new in this administration is the blatant, overt nature of the enterprise, a departure from the more covert forms of regime change during the Cold War, and from the softer version of empire insulated by the latticework of international institutions created after 1945 in the name of the international community. That's what's new and different here. Today, regime change is not left to the CIA. After all, they can't be trusted. But instead, regime change arrives in the form of a blitzkrieg of destruction by none other than Rumsfeld and his high-tech weapons. And while the administration still invokes the international community in its quest to bring about the one single sustainable model for success in every corner of the world, which of course is defined as democracy, development, free markets, and free trade, if you read the national security document, that's the one single model of national success. The problem with this is the blatant unilateralism by which the administration conducts itself, and the arrogance of its claims invites mockery from both friend and foe. Consequently, I think that because neoconservatism is so upfront and in your face about its imperial posturing, it's in danger really of accelerating the normal rate by which empires are undermined by imperial overstretch, to use Paul Kennedy's popular term for the phenomenon. So before getting back to that, I want to go back and thread in a bit of the history of the neocons. And since Ruth has named names, I'm going to talk more about the intellectual history, since the journey of the personalities into the Bush administration is well known. Now, what the neocons have done in their formulation of what they call power and principle, I argue, is that they've taken the two dominant paradigms of international relations today, namely realism and liberalism, and they've put them together in a combustible mix of pessimism and optimism, an odd kind of combination. First, the pessimism of realpolitik, which holds that there cannot be peace and security in the world without global domination by the United States. And then the optimistic side in their ability to convince the rest of the world, beginning with Iraq and the Middle East, that there is indeed only one single model, at least only one that will be tolerated, and that furthermore the cost of quelling the resistance will be manageable. Now, this is a departure from traditional realism's caution with regard to overstretch, as well as its preoccupation with stability, in which words like democracy and freedom are anathema, never to be uttered in any serious foreign policy conversations. Traditional realists like Henry Kissinger, for example, were attacked by the first generation of neocons after Vietnam because of support of dictatorships by the Nixon administration and the realists who had gone before. The same attacks against the traditional realist were carried out in the first Bush administration by the neocons against people like Brent Scowcroft, James Baker, and those who had successfully argued for the containment of Saddam Hussein and not for regime change for fear that toppling Saddam would in fact bring about instability and therefore be counterproductive to U.S. interest, which of course is the overwhelming concern of the traditional realist. Now, in Bush's appearance last week before the National Endowment for Democracy, an address that William Safire dubbed the Age of Liberty speech, his most important speech, Safire said. A very interesting read, by the way. Go to the White House website and take a look at the Age of Liberty speech. So in it, the president forcefully underscored the administration's departure from, quote, 60 years of Western nations excusing and accommodating the lack of freedom in the Middle East, which has done nothing to make us safe, because in the long run, stability cannot be purchased at the expense of liberty. Well, these are intoxicating words that hold a good deal of truth. But then you sober up very quickly when you look at who it is that's saying them and why it is that he's saying what he's saying. As one of the neocon luminaries, Michael Ledeen, put it, America's historic mission is not stability, but radical change. Our middle name is chaos in the service of freedom. This is Michael Ledeen. We also have very similar sentiments coming from Max Boot, writing in the Wall Street Journal in the editorial pages. He says, who says you can't export democracy through the barrel of a gun? Classic neoconservative thinking. Boot again, he says, America should not be afraid to fight the savage wars of peace if necessary to enlarge the empire of liberty. The savage wars of peace. the pessimistic side, in order to enlarge the empire of liberty, the optimism. Now, if realism had to be taken out of the hands of the overly cautious, such as Scowcroft and Baker, who did not recognize the golden opportunity presented by the collapse of the Soviet Union, then democracy also had to be seized from the liberals and the Democrats, who were seen as too willing to accept a state and institutional role, whether nationally or internationally, as a cornerstone for the achievement of democracy. Instead, the neocons used the collapse of communism as an opportunity to attack social democracy and the state generally. It was now time for them to make neoliberal market-based democracy the only game in town, or at least the only sustainable model. The first generation of neocons used the same set of tactics in their odyssey from the Democratic to the Republican Party. That's what makes them neo, as opposed to just cons. They were moving from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party in the period after Vietnam, when they became conservative supporters of the messianic Ronald Reagan, who of course thought the concept of democracy was indeed an American invention, and it was our manifest destiny to bring it to the rest of the world. Now, the current generation of neocons are even worse because they believe it's really Reagan's personal gift to the world, the last word on the subject and the end of history, if you will. Now, we all know that the neocons were out of power from 1992 to 2000. And so during this time, though, they zealously promoted the ideas through the 8 Clinton years, noting ruefully in one document in the year 2000 by the Project of American Century in September of 2000, they said that their agenda would be hard to sell to the American public short of another Pearl Harbor. The opportunity arrived 1 year later, September 11th, 2001, the tragic event which indeed enabled them to frame their imperial ambitions as a response to global terrorism. Now, in the interim, as Ruth points out, with an unexpected stroke of luck, Dick Cheney was appointed to head the transition team, where he was able to bring Paul Wolfowitz in, and the whole network of neocons were, after that point, soon honeycombed throughout the administration, in defense, national security, the State Department, and the executive branch, all waiting for their opportunity to implement their decade-old vision of empire. So, on to Iraq. It was decided shortly after 9/11. Actually, I said it was decided 10 years ago. The question was a pretext. Needed a pretext to go back to Iraq. I don't know if anyone saw this on CNN, but James Woolsey came out 2 hours later, and I was astonished by his ability to find the imprint of Iraq on what had taken place 2 hours later. And this was an unrelenting theme throughout, that Colin Powell actually had to beat back in order to be able to go to Afghanistan first. You know, look, we have to do Afghanistan first. From the very beginning, the neocons wanted to go directly to Iraq. So the decision was that Iraq would serve as the showcase for the Bush Doctrine, the first step in this ambitious project to reshape the Middle East in America's, the neocons' image. Let's not call it in America's image, hopefully. Now, I want to argue that, ironically, in this very first outing, what we're seeing are the signs of imperial overstretch, in the very first outing of this ambitious project. Now, normally you'd expect imperial overstretch to be a long-term event. But, first of all, we see that resistance is growing. Nationalist resistance and also apparently foreign resistance. And yet we're told that these increasing attacks are a sign of progress. We've now got them where we want them. Rumsfeld actually said that we're fighting terrorism in Baghdad so we don't have to fight it in St. Louis. But is attacking an occupation force terrorism? Answer, no. And does it really follow that those dedicated to terrorist acts in the United States will now be satisfied to take it out on American soldiers? Well, maybe for a while, but the answer ultimately is no. So, the logic is quite the opposite. Second, the other aspect of imperial overstretch, in addition to the resistance from those who are subject to regime change, is the phenomenon of counterbalance by other great powers, other world powers. So when we look at the issue of counterbalancing behavior, even at this early juncture, what we see is that European and Asian powers are indeed beginning to carve out independent postures of their own, given their lack of confidence in where this administration is headed and the unilateralism by which it carries out its policies, even as it's speaking in the name of the international community. Could start, of course, with the resistance to the war last spring, and now, of course, the refusal to take the bait and to bail out the United States without a genuine shift in authority. Another case in point is if you consider what happened to the other members of the axis of evil. Very interesting. Those two other members of the axis of evil. In the case of Iran, Iran was gloating last week that they'd halted an American conspiracy in its tracks because they'd agreed to International Atomic Energy Commission mediated inspections of its laboratories, basically as a result of the intervention of European powers against the U.S. charges that Iraq was engaged in a nuclear arms program. So we have an inspection regime going into Iran, over and against the wishes of the Bush administration, precisely because European powers asserted themselves. Similarly, China has taken an assertive role in working with South Korea to bring the United States to a diplomatic solution in the standoff with North Korea over its proclaimed proliferation of nuclear weapons. It's very interesting. North Korea, unlike everyone else, has said, no, we're not doing anything like that. North Korea says, yeah, we are. That's right. Even if they're not. As a deterrent. I mean, the others, they're saying, yes, they are, and North Korea said, no, they're not. But North Korea says, no, we really are, as their own deterrent strategy. Now, why would they do that? Because they're included in this axis of evil. As a result of all this, the Bush administration has been reduced to targeting Syria, as its latest candidate for the, savage wars of peace that are going to expand the empire of liberty. Okay, so the other part of this, when we look at Imperial Overstretch, is the impact it has at home, and to the degree to which you then get a backlash and a resistance on the part of the hegemonic power itself. Now, it's very interesting because when we look at the address that President Bush made requesting the $87 billion supplemental increase to continue its strategy in Iraq, this really served as a sobering experience for Congress and many others who had previously been tuned out, essentially resulting in this growing debate about the cost of empire when coupled with the tax cuts for the wealthy and the corporations, and what all this portends in terms of further assault on what's left of the social contract at home. It's very interesting. The Army Times had a headline story entitled "An Act of Betrayal." And what they were pointing out was how this administration is cutting back the health care benefits of families. In addition, to add insult to injury, they're also lowering the amount of the death gratuity. So, the New York Times prefaced its coverage of Bush's speech that night, asking for the $87 billion, by saying it's a good thing the kids were already in bed because it's the kids in bed and their children who will be saddled with the growing debt burden for generations. Now, so in response to all these setbacks and contradictions, the administration has become somewhat of a caricature of itself. It actually, I believe, endangers satirists. Very, very difficult. Where do you go for satire when the administration is self-satirizing? There are days now, even when if you look at Doonesbury, Gary Trudeau, all he can do is faithfully document the words of Cheney, Bush, and Rumsfeld and supply some accompanying illustrations. I mean, what more can you do? I mean, think of this. Recall a few weeks back, Bush went to the Philippines and he called it a model of democracy for Iraq and the Middle East. Never mind the bloody war, the long, long occupation, the puppet regimes after the occupation ended, and then the support for the dictator Marcos by none other than Ronald Reagan before the Philippines actually achieved democracy. Well, sort of. They didn't exactly achieve democracy. As Bush's limousine traveled from the airport into Manila, he was greeted by billboards extolling neoliberal progress that had been put up where before, a few days earlier, there had stood vast shanty towns of poor people whose homes were bulldozed for the 6-hour visit of the president. So is this Iraq's future? Is this a future for others around the world, if this is the single model of success? On the day the Liberty speech was given, the Bay Area public in the Chronicle was treated to this interesting image. Perhaps many of you saw this with your cereal in the morning. Bush calls on Middle East to open arms to democracy. Hussein's fall, a watershed for the world. And someone should be given a prize for this, by the way, whoever placed this photo here, because we have the photo of an American soldier standing watch over an Iraqi with a hood over his head in this humiliated position. Now, one of the things we always hear about what drives resistance, nationalist resistance, as well as terrorist, is the word humiliation. So here we have humiliation being presented on the road to democracy. Also, a day after the speech, I found this, which said that the United States military was now going to remind the town from which the one particular attack had come that we have teeth and claws and we will use them. Now, this is less than 24 hours after the president is telling us and attempting to exhort the Iraqis to accept American-style democracy. So, what did they do? There was an onslaught of rockets and 500-pound bombs, U.S. warplanes and tanks battered suspected guerrilla hideouts. What does this look like on the ground? One grandmother said, "The sky was red with explosions and my grandchildren were screaming." If this were not enough, the neoconservative minions in Congress have taken it upon themselves to oversee international studies programs in higher education. Have you heard about that? International studies programs in higher education. All of this has come after congressional testimony by Hoover Institution neocon Stanley Kurtz, who labeled international studies programs, especially Middle East studies, as hotbeds of anti-Americanism. So, Congress, in its alarm after this testimony, passed the International Studies Higher Education Act, which will appoint and oversight unanimously now, which will appoint an oversight committee in Congress over the curriculum, over who teaches in area studies and international studies, looking for fairness and balance, of course. And it's going to be housed in Homeland Security. This really is it's the follow-on. This is not an anomaly. This is the follow-on to Daniel Pipe's much maligned and much ridiculed Campus Watch blacklist a few years back. By the way, Tariq Ali's name was on that, as one of those dangerous people that appears on a reading list, along with Arundhati Roy. I remember those that were there for sure. So, in conclusion, if this keeps up, the neocons may well supersede the record of empires that have preceded them, but not in the way that they might choose. That is, not by establishing a record for longevity to which they aspire, but instead for the alacrity by which they bring about their own demise. But I realize that may sound a bit optimistic, even Pollyannish, and I was reminded of it this morning over my cereal with my latest chronicle here, which gives us some cautionary ideas here that we must consider. And it says in the date book section, I start in the back and work forward because I really have to have some coffee before I can get to the front. Americans have a love affair with audacity. Why we embrace liars and cheats. So, despite the contradictions, it's not a foregone conclusion that the Imperial Overstretch is going to be accelerated, but I think it's certainly worth our discussion. Thank you.
For many years, and in fact for many decades, a debate used to go on in this country and outside it as to whether the United States was an empire at all. The neocons, as the previous speakers have pointed out, have ended the debate by saying very clearly, yeah, we are an empire, and what are you going to do about it? And on one level, it's straight talk. And I think the responses are coming from different parts of the world in different shapes and forms and different tactics. But the fact that the United States has been a major power for a long, long time is indisputable. It has never been forced to act alone till recently. That's what makes it quite an interesting and novel situation. Even during the days of the Monroe Doctrine could not have been implemented in South America without the British Navy, which was determined to keep the other European powers out of South America, so was quite happy to see the United States playing the role of the local cop and policing South America. So the United States was always dependent on support from elsewhere in the early days and the early decades of the empire. Then you had the Cold War period. During the Cold War period, US leadership of the capitalist world was accepted by the capitalist world. But even in that period, it's quite interesting. Though all the defeated countries which had now been rebuilt, reconstructed, had become major powers in their own right, Japan, Germany, France, which had been completely wrecked, Britain was in a pretty bad state, had to be rebuilt, etc., with US help. And as a result of this, American leadership was accepted in Europe, in the Far East, elsewhere. And the reason it was accepted was because these people thought they were under a massive threat from a new revolutionary wave. The Chinese Revolution had taken place, the Korean Peninsula was divided, Vietnam was divided, etc., etc. I don't need to go through the whole picture. And so American leadership was accepted to defend capitalism against the threat of revolutions and anti-capitalist movements. But even at that time, it was impossible for the United States to find a single of its Western European allies to go and fight in Vietnam. Not a single Western European country, including Britain, agreed to go and fight in Vietnam. The only countries who did were the Australians and the South Koreans. Apart from them, none of the US allies at a time when its leadership was not challenged or questioned wanted to go and do that. And the reason for that was that despite the fact that sides had been taken in the Cold War, the very existence of the Soviet Union, China, etc., provided space for countries who weren't in either camp to disagree, and for countries who were in one camp to use the existence of that bloc not to go along with the United States on everything. The big difference now is that there is no countervailing force on the level of state power anywhere in the world. That's the big difference. And add to that this is the first time, as I constantly stress, that we have a single big power, empire, whatever you want to call it, without challenge on a global scale. The size of the US military budget alone, the increase in the US military budget last year alone is the total size of the Chinese military budget. So there's no question that militarily, this country is unchallengeable, and everyone knows that. And it's precisely this situation which makes the world an extremely dangerous place at the moment, because of the way in which the Bush administration has tried to use this power and muscle to get its way. As they said, as Condi Rice said after 9/11, let's use this to get our way wherever we want to. Hence they discussed taking out Iraq before even Afghanistan. No one else anywhere in the world believes that Saddam Hussein had any links with Al-Qaeda, except in the United States, because that's what the media and the intelligence organizations have been saying. Even in Britain, which is quite a tame country and linked into this country on many levels, no one believes that. So what is the situation as we find it now? We have a giant country, very dominant, economically feeling economically threatened and determined to use its military power never to allow itself to be challenged economically. I think if you want to express the situation in a nutshell, that is it. And that's what the national strategy doctrine says, more or less. We will never allow our dominance to be challenged by anyone else, and if necessary, we shall use force to do so. Classic imperial statement made by a big empire. Historically, you have similar statements made by the British at the height of their empire. The big difference between the British and the American empire is that the British wanted to have direct control. So they went in occupied countries and stayed there. And the balance sheet, I say this for those fashionable colonialists today who think this was a good thing, that the balance sheet of the British rule in India was a total disaster. When they left India after 200 years, 85% of that country was predominantly rural, and mass illiteracy stood at 94%. So the notion that these empires do some modernizations is not the case with the largest country to be occupied by a European empire. Not the case. They educated the elite, and they built an effective public transport system to transport stuff from the ports into the interior, and they built a strong army and an administrative service. That was the extent of their legacy. If they had wanted, they could have educated the entire population. But of course, the danger is if you do that, you'll be chucked out sooner than you're prepared to be chucked out. So you don't do it. And that is why the question of Iraq becomes very important again. And that is why I find it utterly despicable that a whole gang of liberals and former leftists are going around defending this as somehow we haven't seen this before. I mean, the British took the bulk of Africa, saying that they were going to do it to wipe out slavery and bring freedom, a country which had grown rich on slavery. So, when we come to Iraq, we see a three-pronged operation. What is this? The real aim of the war in Iraq, the principal aim was, as I have said, not principally oil, though that's always in the background, but a display of imperial power, a display of the new national strategic doctrine, a display of what this administration was capable of doing. Though Philip Bobbitt, in his book The Shield of Achilles, argues very strongly that Clinton had already started this process in the Balkans, that the Bush people did it more aggressively. He's very proud of that, Bobbitt, because he was an advisor to Clinton in the White House and now is totally backing Bush and says that where people see discontinuity, there is continuity. And there is an element of truth in that. Clinton, of course, did things differently. But nonetheless, they were done. And on that one point, a sort of a footnote occurs. Would the war in Iraq have been justifiable if it had been carried out with the support of the United Nations Security Council and if there had been French and German troops fighting alongside Americans and Britishers? For me, the answer is obviously no. Absolutely not. Why would that make the war on Iraq morally justifiable if the Security Council had supported it? It wouldn't have. I mean, these people made it easier for going in any event, though the French ambassador, you will recall, shouted at Colin Powell and said, you had authorization from the very first resolution we passed, but you wanted to thrust a second resolution down our throats. And the reason they wanted a second resolution was because Blair insisted on it, because he felt he wouldn't survive a parliamentary vote in the House of Commons unless he had a second resolution. So the notion somehow that it would have been fine if it had been backed by the Security Council, is laughable, absolutely laughable. So instead of, they didn't get that, and they went and took Iraq, and they thought, this was the big mistake they made. They thought, because of what they were told by Iraqis already on their payroll, that it would be roses. I'm not kidding. You read the stuff they said. You will be greeted with flowers and sweets, the Iraqi quislings told them in Washington. That's what will happen, said Kenan Makia when he was given an audience in the White House. Invade, people are ready, waiting to be liberated. Well, what happened? Even in the strongest centers of anti-Saddam and anti-Ba'athist sentiment, people were angry. And this is such an elementary mistake that it's staggering to think that a serious government composed of people thinking strategically didn't understand that. Of course, curiously enough, sections of the intelligence agencies and the Pentagon here and in Britain understood this much, much more than the politicians. They said, look, this occupying a country is a massive problem, not because the occupation itself is going to be difficult. We can do that with our power, but what do you do afterwards? And they had no idea. And so what had to happen, happened. People like me predicted before the war that within 6 months you'd have a very strong and functioning resistance. I was pessimistic, I have to say that. The resistance started within 2 weeks of the occupation. And the CIA report, which has just been handed to Bush, now says that the resistance is quite a large size. And I've noticed that they've stopped saying these are just remnants of the old regime, which is the argument they put forward, because the information we're getting out of Iraq is there are 44 different resistance organizations, large and small, composed of different political currents, and active in most parts of the country. And if you look, essentially, in what they're trying to do is make it impossible for the American occupation authorities to govern the country. Classic scorched earth tactics are being carried out. You won't let us rule, well, you're not going to be able to rule it, and they're shaken. And this resistance has, even on this level, which is a fairly classical first stage guerrilla resistance to occupation. You can see it if you study what happened in Algeria when they started fighting to get rid of the French. You can see it if you compare it to what happened in Vietnam, the early stages, not the late stages. It always is like this. And it's no different in terms of targets from what was being targeted by the Algerian FNL or the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. Unfortunately, because its occupations are ugly and horrible, the resistance does use tactics which are equally ugly and horrible. But you have to decide who you want to win in that particular conflict. That's the problem. And so what they've been targeting from their point of view has been effective. The UN headquarters being attacked was not a surprise to any Iraqis because of the role the UN has played in Iraq over the last 15 years. First as administrators of the killer sanctions that wrecked the country and destroyed its social infrastructure. And secondly is authorizing weekly Anglo-American bombing raids on Iraq for 12 years. So people know, and some of the journalists there reported it, said the people on the streets were not at all, said, why is the UN here after all, given what they've done to us? So it's a total mess. That's the reality. A total and complete mess for the US administration and for the population of Iraq. They shouldn't have gone in there. Having gone in there, they were unable to do anything. God knows what they thought they were going to do. Very few people in the country want them there, and they now have a very limited choice, in my opinion. What is this choice? The choice is, because it's a choice which affects domestic politics in the United States, is to pull out as many American troops as possible and replace them either with the Eastern European satellites who can't fight. You know, there's a big story a few weeks ago in Najaf where there was a street riot and the Bulgarians and Ukrainians wouldn't come out of their barracks. I don't blame them. Why should they? The question is, what the hell are they doing in the barracks in Najaf and Karbala anyway? I mean, they were pretty useless even when they were Russian satellites, and they're equally useless as American satellites. So they're not going to be effective. The British are playing a very low-key role, incidentally, if you've observed. They tend to use rubber bullets, they try not to kill, they're an experienced colonial army, and they won't want to be left there alone to take the hits. The choice is Turkey, but if you bring the Turkish army in, which the United States has been discussing with the Turkish military, they don't want to come in to take the hits instead of you. What they want to come and do is occupy the Kurdish areas and get hold of the Turkish Kurds who've been taking refuge there against the repression by the Turkish army over the last 25 years, and control that region. If that is permitted, and it would be so crazy to do that, I can't see even this administration doing it. If that were to be permitted, the one area in Iraq which they've paid off and which is supporting them, the Kurdish area, not all of it, but the main tribal organizations would erupt. So you would then have the whole country against the occupation, and that would be the beginning of the end. So that is not going to work. The Arab states will not get involved in this, as you've seen, for obvious reasons. It would be crazy to bring in Israel to occupy Iraq. I'm sure the thought will occur to someone, but I think they'll resist it. And I think there would be probably, even inside the Israeli establishment, a total revolt if Sharon tries or offered that we'd go and run Iraq for you. So that's not going to happen. So sooner or later, they will have to withdraw. And that is a thing which the Bush administration must be having nightmares about. They were warned by some people on their own side, don't do it, and they've done it. And every single day the casualties go up. And people are noticing that here. I mean, you know, okay, you can stop having body bags photographed, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. And so the only other serious alternative, which they might go in for if they decide that politically it's impossible to pull out, because it would be, we went in to try and say that we've sorted out the Vietnam syndrome, so if we pull out, people will say, oh God, you haven't. You still can't occupy and run a country. So what do you do? If they decide to stay in semi-permanently, they will have to reintroduce the draft in the United States of America. It becomes virtually impossible then to carry on recruiting poor volunteers from the Latino and Afro-American populations to keep an occupation going. You have to reintroduce the draft, and reintroducing the draft in the United States today would be politically suicidal. So let's hope they do it. Meanwhile, this resistance in Iraq, low intensity, first stage, classic guerrilla resistance in Iraq, is beginning to change the picture globally. That's the interesting thing. First in the United States itself. A lot of Democrats who'd lost their tongues after 9/11, because of the resistance, are beginning to speak up. Congressmen, I think 10 or 15 Democratic congressmen demanded that Rumsfeld was sacked, which is only repeating what lots of soldiers, US soldiers, have said in the field in Baghdad anyway. But just imagine if there had been no resistance. Just imagine. If there had been no resistance in Iraq, every single supporter of the war and this administration would have claimed it as a massive triumph. Imagine. It would have depressed the whole Arab world and the whole world if nothing happens. A big triumphalist chorus would have gone up. We told you we were right. They can't say that now. So it's having an effect on US politics without any doubt, and will carry on having it, not on the same scale as Vietnam, which had an effect after all after 10 years, but in this case the effect will be quicker. It's almost as if history is being telescoped in what's going on in Iraq at the present time. Secondly, all this talk about taking out Syria and Iran, well, the Syrians and Iranians are saying, given what you're facing in Iraq, do you really want to try it on? If so, come. Come. Who are you going to send to occupy Syria and Iraq? The Israelis can go and bomb the Iranian nuclear reactor, but that's, air raids. Occupying these countries is going to be a very difficult operation. They're not going to be able to do it. So all that talk has gone out of the window because of the resistance in Iraq. Now, the third big issue in the Middle East is, of course, the continuing occupation of Palestine. The day after Baghdad fell, Ariel Sharon said publicly to the Palestinians, now I hope you will come to your senses because your great big protector is gone. As if the whole Palestinian question was dependent on Saddam Hussein. It's a real colonial way of thinking that the Arabs are people who need a headman. A village can't function without its headman. The British used to do that. And no one clearly studied the history of Iraqi resistance to the British Empire, which is, for that alone, the heads of the American intelligence agencies should be fired. They should have read the reports written by British intelligence in the 40s and 50s when they were occupying Iraq. What did they write in these reports? They were actually incredibly brilliant reports and very accurate. British intelligence, head of the British intelligence team who visited Iraq in the early 50s or late 40s, I can't totally remember, sent a big report back saying the situation is disastrous. All that we have succeeded in doing in Iraq is creating an oligarchy of racketeers. To which the British Foreign Office replied, this is going a bit far. They're not all racketeers. But at least they were Iraqi racketeers. What the Bush gang is doing is sending in Bechtel and Halliburton. So you won't even have an oligarchy of Iraqi racketeers, you'll have an oligarchy of American racketeers going in and running the country, with companies being privatized, with American companies being given the franchise, with privatized mercenaries being sent to defend the oil pipeline. Just think about it. It isn't going to work. There is no way out of this mess. And democracy, well, you saw the photograph you were shown. That is just one. Even where the occupation isn't resisted militarily, where you have protectorates like in Bosnia and in Kosovo, if you go and study what's going on there, they hate the colonial type occupation. They find it horrible that a large bulk of their women have to become prostitutes to service the foreign armies which are stationed there. They don't like it. But that's different. In a country like Iraq, where you have armed resistance to the occupation, the only colonial model now on offer is a mixture of Gaza and Guantanamo. That's the only model they have to offer. You've seen photographs, I don't know whether they've appeared in the US press, just tragic photographs. It's an Afro-American soldier going into an Iraqi house and tying hands of 3 little girls and then putting these arms behind their backs. This is what colonial occupations do. They have a logic, whether you want to do it or not. So all this talk about we're bringing democracy to the Middle East, people laugh at it in that part of the world. And not just there, in most parts of the world. And I return, therefore, to what happens here being crucial. People ask me when I speak in the United States, do you think Bush being defeated in the elections would be positive? Well, I say, obviously it would be positive. How could it be negative? It would also be a slap in the face publicly for all those who've backed this absurd adventure, regardless of who the Democrat is. The only Democrat who can succeed Bush, whoever it is, I don't even care. One doesn't have any illusions about them. But a defeat for Bush would be a positive thing because it would be seen as a defeat for these policies which have been implemented in Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. That's what's important, and that's why dissent has to be preserved and protected. I mean, it is shocking that any US citizen can be lifted off the streets and locked up for weeks without trial, or even without a trial being considered. I mean, that is, according to the latest laws, that can be done, and is being done. Even Al Gore felt obliged to attack it quite sharply a few days ago. And that is why, in particular, I think, given that dissent is under attack, what is studied in the academy is under attack, the academy has a responsibility to defend and nurture dissent. And I very much hope that in this university, Berkeley, which has a long tradition, where the free speech movement was born, that the 3 students still under suspension for what they did in February against the war, that this suspension itself is suspended and they are allowed back in with full rights. It's not the way to proceed by victimizing. Not the way to build what even a Republican president once called, Eisenhower referred to, who said that democracy in the United States is under threat, in his famous speech on the military-industrial complex taking over this country. And he said the only way we can defend democracy in the United States is by having a vigilant and alert citizenry. A vigilant and alert citizenry nurtured by Fox TV, nurtured by the networks as they report the news today, nurtured by a bulk of the print media? I don't think so. So who is going to nurture it? It has to be nurtured in different ways within the labor movement, within the academy, then alternative institutions, since the institutions very close to the state, especially the media, which has become a vital player now in politics all over the globe, aren't going to do it. And they don't do it. They trivialize politics. There is less reporting of what's going on in the world in this so-called epoch of globalization than there was 25, 30 years ago, when you had more reports on what was happening in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, etc. That's what makes a citizenry vigilant and alert. And I'll tell you something, and say it to the great thinker president who wants to bring democracy to the Middle East. Why not start by strengthening democracy in the United States itself? And why not aid those who are doing that? And why not look at what's happening just below you in the whole continent of Latin America, where there is a revolt in every single country against neoliberal economics now. Every single country is up in arms against it in some way or another. And the one country which has had the most democratic constitution voted on by 2/3 of its population, and a president, Hugo Chavez, elected 6 different times by his people, you try and topple 1 year before you invade Iraq. And you want the Arabs to believe you're defending democracy. It just doesn't wash any of this guff. No one believes it. It's designed essentially, I don't know for what, for domestic consumption possibly. But it's not working. And when you have now an international system in place in which one leg is the Washington Consensus, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and the other leg is American military power, resistance will mount and resistance will develop in different parts of the globe, and that's as it should be.
Okay, let me ask one question, which is how do you deal with the problem of democracy in the Middle East? Obviously, this administration's strategy does not work. And obviously, there are particular problems in the Middle East that at some point have to be resolved. For example, the Palestine-Israel conflict. But that aside, what is a viable strategy for moving that part of the world toward democracy and republicanism? Tariq, in his new book, talks about the failure of democracy to take hold in Iraq.
Well, I would say that, I'm certainly very strongly in favor of democratic accountability in democratic institutions in all these countries. You can never impose them from the outside. That's the key to understand. It will only happen when a bulk of the people there want it to happen, like has happened in large parts of Latin America. But there's an added problem in that region, which we haven't talked about, but which is so obvious we all know about it, which is oil. And historically, Western imperial powers have never appreciated democracy in oil-producing countries, starting from Iran in the 50s right up till now. You see what's happening in Venezuela, another oil-producing country. And the reason is that once you permit democracy in an oil-producing country, as has happened when you've had popular revolutions, one of the first things they want to do is control their own oil. And that will happen in Iraq. If you have a constituent assembly elected in Iraq, two things they will say. One, all foreign troops out. Two, Iraqi control of Iraqi oil. The third problem which has developed is that the fear of Islamism has gone so deep that they are frightened that if democratic elections take place in Egypt, etc., the Islamists will win. Well, look, you can't have it both ways. Democracy doesn't mean that democracy is only permitted when people you like are going to win. We'd never have it anywhere on that basis. So I think, incidentally, that even if an Islamist party wins, it's better to have it than not. Algeria is a case where it was interrupted halfway, and the result has been one of the ugliest and most unpleasant civil wars in the region. Not much discussed or talked about, but horrendous.
I think the vision of democracy is fundamentally flawed in this idea of the incremental spread outward. Kant may have been right about that in 1795, but we live in a different type of world today. I think that the only way to think about democracy within countries is to create the kind of international system which indeed nourishes and promotes the bases by which countries can in fact move toward democracy without having it cloaked in particular interest of superpowers and getting it all involved with the issue of U.S. interest and empire. The kiss of death for people working for human rights and for democracy all over the world, but particularly the Middle East, is to have to have Washington associated with it. We've got it completely turned around. That is, if we're really sincere about promoting democracy, we have to take it out of the realpolitik and place it into an international context that indeed supports the democratization process.
Issues that none of you touched upon was the opposition in important sectors in the military to this conflict. I can think of Zinni, General Zinni, as one who was very outspoken, and it was very clear, and this actually raises another point, there seemed to have been more opposition from the military than there was from the Democratic Party, because the military was at least on the record as saying, well, if you're going to do this, you need so many troops. How do you account for this? Do anybody want to?
I think military in general, when someone's fought in a war, they know what war is like. They know this. They knew this would not be a cakewalk. Most of the military understood that. And we're seeing resistance in areas that we didn't see so quickly in Vietnam or other wars, and that is the families of the soldiers. There are large organizations now of military families who are speaking out very seriously against the war. Tariq, a historian last year, you used the word telescope. A historian last year talked about Iraq is Vietnam on speed. And it is, in certain ways. I mean, there are many differences and important differences, and the analogy doesn't go all the way. But there's no question that what we saw in Vietnam is happening at some things. The resistance, now the Iraqization. Any minute I expect helicopters to be leaving from some building, but when will that happen? Sooner or later, we will be withdrawing. And the military is already involved in a resistance. There are veterans from Vietnam who are sending open letters to troops in Iraq. The soldiers in Iraq have been writing, they've been publishing letters in American press, which is astonishing because the things that they're saying and the kinds of statements they're making would be really very dangerous to themselves, and yet they're signing them. So yes, I think we're seeing a military resistance at the bottom level, but as well as at the top. And I think Wesley Clark probably will be able to take advantage of that.
Yeah, I think there's one thing troubling in this, and that is that this resistance is indeed coming from National Guard people with jobs, with wives and children, as well as husbands. And clearly, there's a lot of resistance to that because of that particular demographic. Now, the issue of whether a draft might be put into place because of this, I don't think can be entirely discounted. Right now, my diligent students in peace and conflict studies have found, in terms of their research, that the draft boards are currently being reconstituted. Letters are going out to communities asking them to serve on draft boards.
That's right.
So the difference in Vietnam and in this war is that most of the people dying in Vietnam, they were under 21 years old. They were not daughters. They were not mothers. Many of them weren't fathers or husbands. 19, 20-year-old men from the margins. So if this administration continues, I don't see it changing its course. And then we have to face the issue of what the Democrats do. And the problem, I lack a lot of confidence in the Democrats in the sense of this idea that we must support the troops. You know, that old canard. We have to support the troops. We're already there. Therefore, it was a terrible policy, but now we're in it. Our credibility is at stake. We have to support the troops. And so what I worry about here is the potential of the Democrats being able to internationalize this conflict, to put it under UN auspices. And as Democrats will do. Democrats are known much more than Republicans. Republicans are Rumsfeld types. They like space. They like high tech. Democrats historically have been army people, putting troops on the ground much more readily than Republicans. So we're far from out of the woods on this issue of military resistance, I think. And actually, I'd like to ask Tariq, what do you think the prospects would be of bringing along you know, many of the large players that would have to be part of any kind of international community backing for this, to actually maybe some semblance of authority transition that would allow them to do this and get the U.S. off the hook?
I think it's, on that question first, I think it's very difficult for them to achieve that precisely because of the resistance. The Iraqi resistance organizations have said, even if you come wearing blue helmets, we are not going to stop. We just want you all out of there. Everyone knows that. And the killing, the death of 14 Italian soldiers 2 days ago has shaken that country, and there's been a massive upsurge in the anti-war movement saying, we told you we don't want our kids being killed, pull them out. That's the big demand on Berlusconi. So I think the Democrats would be more effective at managing that, but even with them, I don't think it's going to work. I really don't. But to come to Harry's question, this division existed also in Britain. And Britain this may surprise you, is a much more secretive country than the United States, where, you know, you have Dan Ellsbergs and people coming out there. They really do keep things under control. So I was quite stunned when, after the fall of Baghdad, this is even after the war in Iraq was supposedly had come to an end, a senior figure in the intelligence community, who was head of the Joint Intelligence Committee for 3 crucial years, Blair's national security advisor at number 10 Downing Street, Sir Roderick Braithwaite, wrote an open letter to the Financial Times in which he denounced the war, in which he said that the people of the country had been hoodwinked and misled and scared, and he pointed out 3 things the government had done which were totally fake. And then he sort of reserved his scorn for Blair. He said, it's an amazing phrase for a senior figure to use, he said, fishmongers sell fish, warmongers sell war. I think our Prime Minister oversold his wares. But now, and you know, this reflected, it was obvious even before the war and during it that sections of the intelligence were leaking stuff like mad to the press, just leaking stuff to try and bring Blair down. They didn't succeed, but his credibility is now completely at an end, and Bush going there will be very helpful to us, actually.
I'm going to ask one more question. How do you account for the failure of the democratic process, and I don't mean the Democratic Party here, to have a reasoned debate in the United States over the war, before the war? Because the fact of the matter is, one has the sense that, in fact, there was a consensus. It was really a disagreement about how to do it. The Senate did pass, and the President Clinton did sign the Iraqi, whatever it was called, Regime Change Act. So the fact of the matter is that both sides can always claim that the other side was there with them, even if they deny that after the fact. So what is the reason for this failure of the democratic process in foreign policy in the United States? Anybody?
Well, I'd like to address that, because I think we have to remember that 9/11 really did create fear, and this administration manipulated that fear with a series of huge lies. And the American people were lied to in very serious ways. You tell people that there's weapons of mass destruction. You tell people that al-Qaeda is in Iraq. You tell people that Saddam Hussein is responsible for 9/11. And you suddenly have this blurring and the conflation of 9/11 and Saddam Hussein has to go. I mean, what is astonishing is the big lie, and sometimes the big lie works. And I think when fear is manipulated, as it has been, people will be more passive, particularly after 9/11. To me, as to others here, it was astonishing that people could believe what was being said. And yet the American people had a very high sense of support for the war before it began. There was debate, of course. There was a huge anti-war movement all around the world. But in the sense that you're talking about, the Democrats really were silent.
Yeah, I would just say that certainly the fear factor, but then in addition there's the flattery factor as well. Ronald Reagan mastered the two. George Bush styles himself not after his father, but after Ronald Reagan, as the kind of playing to the narcissism of the nation. That we indeed have this historic mission to the world. That's a big part of it. If you look at the national security strategy in 2002, it's not only realpolitik, it's this odd neocon vision of the continuing of manifest destiny into the 21st century, which is resonates deep in American history and American political culture. And in addition to that, just one more thing. I think, just a rather pedestrian point, but in terms of the political cycle and weak legislatures, simply nobody wants to get tagged with the losses that might. If the administration is triumphant, nobody wants to be seen as standing in their way. And so they vote, and then they vote in such a way that they can always say that they also did it with great reluctance. So it's that kind of weak legislature problem and a strong executive power, I think, as well.
Yeah. I agree with both those comments. I think 9/11 played a very big part in pushing this down the throats of the American population. I think people were pretty traumatized by those attacks, and the regime utilized them, especially the propaganda, in an absolutely horrendous way. It's interesting that in Britain, Blair found it very difficult to win over the population for this war, which is why they went in for these lies. We could be attacked within 45 minutes. That was the lie we were told in Britain, which we challenged on the spot and said it's a lie. Prove it. Where's your evidence? You know, we said this on television. And the interesting thing is that the size of the anti-war mobilizations in Britain, which were not proportionately that different from the United States, incidentally, did have one big impact, that they showed Labour members of Parliament that this would be one step too far. And so you had the biggest rebellion in the British Parliament against a sitting Prime Minister from his own party. And that's when they upped the lies. It now has become clear that they carried on the lies to win over the crucial 20 Labour members of Parliament, without whom Blair would have become totally dependent on Conservative votes to survive. So I think the big problem is in the United States, and the total capitulation of the Democratic politicians to the Republican agenda means that it's very difficult for them to win the next election, incidentally, unless, you know, the things completely collapse in Iraq. That's what they've done for themselves.
Okay, so we'll take two people at each mic, and we are planning to end at 9, so make your question short.
This is a question for anybody on the panel. I'm just trying to understand somehow a little more clearly the mindset of the people who are governing us today. And I'm asking the question specifically, Tariq, you keep sort of ascribing a certain kind of rationality to our leaders, in the sense that, well, they're going to go, they won't go into Syria or Iran because, you know, look, we're in a situation where, you know, who's going to go in there? Or they're not going to alienate the Kurds because, after all, then we won't have any friends there at all. Now, I just heard a report 2 days ago, I think, that they attacked some Kurdish resistance group, the PKK. So I'd like to understand what's driving this a little more clearly. Thank you.
Well, look, if we reach a position where we say that there is absolutely no rational basis at all, not on our basis, but their basis, that's what we're talking about. In this country, then the situation is extremely frightening. But I don't believe that. I think of course, Iraq was not rational from our point of view, but from their point of view, trying to establish U.S. hegemony on a global scale, they thought they could do it. After all, they've done it before. To show the world who the power is, they bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's the similar type of thing which was intended, shot across the bows of the Far East and the Europeans, etc. So from their point of view, horrible though it is, it did have a neocon rationalism behind it. But for now, given the scale of resistance in Iraq, where the CIA is saying that there are at least 55,000 guerrilla fighters, it's a hell of a lot, by the way. It's whether it's true, I don't know. Iraqis claim 100,000, but whatever, it's a very large force. With the American army stretched and forced to depend on the subsidiaries, for them to send in the troops to overthrow a regime in Syria and Iran, if they want, it's not just a question of rationality, it's a question now of logistics. They don't have the troops to do it. Basically, it's as simple as that.
Next question here, please.
Yeah, I want to first articulate my concurrence with everybody on the panel's notion that the venture into Iraq was an unmitigated disaster for all sides concerned. But I do have a question for Mr. Ali. The first two speakers examined the neocon impact with some of the complexity that I think is appropriate. And it's important, if we're to combat this in the future, that we look at the complexity. Mr. Ali, however, reduced it to the old neo-Marxian, post-colonial rationalizations, trying to draw an analogy between the Algerian freedom fighters and the National Liberation Front, and the largely Ba'athist, and I defy you to tell me otherwise because it's totally unfounded, the largely Ba'athist pro-Saddam Hussein resistance in Iraq. There's no correspondence with that. It's similar to Noam Chomsky when he, in 1977, drew the analogy between the Khmer Rouge and French liberation fighters during the Second World War. So the question, Mr. Ali, is how can you possibly, you can trot out numbers like 44 different groups, but how can you possibly say that the vast majority of the resistance isn't pro-Saddam Hussein?
Well, I don't know about neo-Marxian and post-colonial studies. I've not been involved in either. Hope you haven't been reading too many neocon websites. But as far as your question is concerned, the information we get is the information we get from Iraqi sources. And these Iraqi sources are obviously opposition sources, but they're not Baathists. Look, obviously some Baathists and Baathist elements, because it was a large political force, are fighting in that country. Just as, you know, like a number of Baathist remnants are collaborating with the occupation. Quite a few of them, including senior officials from the former defense ministry, are trying to uncover what this resistance is for Mr. Bremer. And it's very, very similar. You know, being historical and trying to place things in a historical perspective, I mean, if that's what Marxism is, then I'm very happy to be one. But it's when you occupy a country, there is a certain logic to how you occupy it, how you deal with it. And the resistance also then develops a certain logic in how to fight the occupation, whoever the occupier is. That's why there are similarities, not total analogies, between Iraq and Vietnam and Algeria. It's not the same situation. The people leading the resistance are different, though in the case of Algeria, not so different, incidentally. With the Vietnamese, that was a communist-led resistance. In Algeria, it was a nationalist-led resistance. In Iraq today, it is a nationalist-led resistance, whether you like it or not. And you have to decide whether these people have the right to chuck the people who've occupied their country out of that country or not. Whether we like them or agree with them is something else.
People in the room have seen the movie Bowling for Columbine. And Michael Moore did us a great service by showing those of people who saw it that this is truly a nation of fear. And I think most of us would agree that without 9/11, W would go down as just an inept person instead of the worst president we've ever seen. Now, my fear is that they will pull something maybe May, June, July, August next year in order to scare people and bring out that fear as a tactic to win the election. Now, my question is, given what you said and given how thinly we have placed troops and how unable we will be to have more massive occupations, do you think that something like that is realistic, that will happen?
An event, an October event, what they used to call
Some
an
event.
Yeah.
Some contrived event.
But of course, it could be on either side,
It
too.
used to be that people voted their pocketbooks. My fear is now, because we are so afraid, that they won't vote their pocketbooks. They'll vote their fears. And that, to me, seems a real possibility that they will do something like that. And I'd like to hear your reactions.
Look, you know, I've been arguing since 9/11 with people in this country and elsewhere that it wasn't a conspiracy carried out by the US administration. I mean, however much one dislikes the Bush administration, one has to be very clear about that. They didn't organize 9/11. They might have wanted to, and they've used it, but they didn't do it. We know the people who did it. They've admitted they've done it. So what can they do? I mean, invade another country? Well, it depends. If the situation in Iraq is like it is, it's going to be extremely difficult for them to do that. Manufacture another crisis? Yeah, but I think even people in the United States are beginning to see through this to a certain extent, precisely because of the mess in Iraq. So I don't think we should exaggerate the strength of the Republican administration. It plays it very big, but I think there is an underlying weakness there. And if there were skillful politicians on the other side to exploit this weakness, they could achieve quite a lot, which would make any foolish maneuvers or propaganda gimmicks counterproductive.
I just want to say that what I worry about is not the Bush administration creating such a crisis, but terrorists, in fact, responding in such a way that we are re-traumatized as a nation. And I can imagine, I've had the scenario in my mind for quite a while. All you need is 5 suicide bombers to attack 5 different malls in 5 different major cities in the United States, and you could bring the American economy to a halt. And you could also have a very traumatized nation. And that fear could be incredibly manipulated. I mean, there are terrorists who would definitely want to attack this country. I'm much more concerned about that happening and that being used by the next election than I am about the Republicans doing it.
Okay, so looking at the clock, that gentleman, why don't you come up, and then we've got 2 on each, and these will be all the questions. Yes, you, sir. Very short, please. Brief.
If I were a conservative, a neocon today, a desperate neocon, I would say democracy be damned. I would go to the British experience in India and come to the political science historians and say, how did they manage it for 200 years? And we could do this with the oil and stop the horrible balance of payments we have today.
Manage it totally successfully, as I pointed out, and there were, rebellions. I mean, there's an interesting statistic which is worth pondering for students of empire, that every single day the British Empire lasted, every single day, there was an act of rebellion and resistance somewhere or the other in some colony. India was a different enterprise, but the only way the British could govern India for so many years was at the maximum they were outside the Second World War. Do you know that the maximum number of British soldiers in India were 34,000? They never had more than them. But in order to do that, they had to win over the consent of the native ruling classes, rulers, owners of property, etc., which they did quite successfully for some time, but which didn't, finally it came to an end. Iraq doesn't offer that possibility. The British tried it in Iraq by making all the tribal chiefs into landlords, and it didn't work because it didn't stop rebellions from below. Also, when the British went into India, it was 1757, and whether we like it or not, the world has moved on a bit, so it's not possible to completely mimic that experience.
One might also say that each day the incident was not reported on the news, which it is today, which must also have an effect here. Yes?
Thank you, Mr. Ali, for coming. I wanted to ask if you could give us some insight on Saudi Arabia and what role that's playing in this scenario, especially with the bombings that took place.
Saudi Arabia is actually, the monarchy is in a very nervous state because they are fearful. They know that there is a very large base in that country for Osama bin Laden and his supporters. There's no doubt about that. This is the country where they have the biggest support. And this is also the country which has been most closely allied, first to the British Empire and subsequently to the United States. And no one calls for democracy in Saudi Arabia. And I wonder why. Because they are fearful that if they call for it, the wrong people might be elected. And I say, but the only way to defeat people like that is through open discussion and debate. So Saudi Arabia remains what it has been for the last 50 years, a kleptocracy run by one family. not unlike mafia franchises which used to be awarded. And first it was given that award by the British, subsequently by the United States. At the same time, there is a lot of ferment and unrest because of hostility to this monarchy. And because of the way it's governed, this is largely a religious opposition, because no secular opposition has been permitted.
Yes, Jerry.
Well, believe it or not, there's some traffic out on websites of the neocons and discussion that takes place about the idea of dismantling the House of Saud, which after all was an imperial creation of the British, and to slice off the eastern half, which holds the major oil fields, and essentially to support a Shiite rebellion in those areas against the Sunni-dominated monarchy. As bizarre as that sounds, and I would say that if Syria can't be done, then clearly that should be off the table, but just to report that it is discussed, and it's in writing.
Yes, please.
I have two quick questions. The first has to do with dissent on campus. I'm one of the 3 students who's facing charges by the university for nonviolently protesting the war in Iraq in April. And I appreciate all of your support by writing to this university about how a university that claims to stand in the tradition of Mario Savio would go after nonviolent protesters now and try to get them suspended and kicked off campus is a pure hypocrisy. But what I wanted to ask about dissent on campus is about things like House Resolution 3077, which is the House resolution that just got passed, which basically allows monitoring of all area studies programs. A forum like this probably next year will not be unmonitored by agencies like the Homeland Security Office and things like Daniel Pipes's attempt to get a major position in the Bush administration. What are the avenues for real dissent on campus, and what can we do to help organize that? The second thing has to do with whether or not the dangers or the problems that the U.S. government is facing are necessarily lead to an overreach that they can't get out of. I actually think that the U.S. government is quite committed to the project in Iraq. In fact, if the resistance were to win, it would be Sure, just really quickly, if they were to win, if the resistance were to win, it'd be a major defeat for the U.S. ruling classes. U.S. capitalism would be in a major crisis. The question that I have, sure, I swear to goodness, 30 seconds. Swear to goodness, is I don't think that it happens automatically, and I think that the other factor in U.S. overreach abroad is dissent at home, and it will not just be a question of whether or not the military logistics work out, but actually, I mean, we can imagine any number of scenarios where they are able to continue an occupation, but dissent at home makes the political cost and the economic cost that much harder, and I'd like to hear your strategies about making that more possible.
Strategies for dissent and also strategies for dealing whatever threats are posed to the university as part of that process. I think that's what sums it up. Anybody? Well, I'll just say one thing. There is a modest hope, for events like this. I mean, very modest and not, but it is the fact that this campus is supporting this dialogue. It will be televised on UCTV, but that's just a drop in the, in the ocean. I understand that.
There are 2 things I'd like to add to that, Harry. And one is that I know that faculty and students all over the country are very aware of the monitoring of area studies and are organizing to protest against this chilling of academic curriculum. A second thing that's happening on the web, which is interesting and just you might want to think about this, is that because so many people really do believe that a draft will be necessary if the United States wants to continue this project, there aren't enough troops, there won't be enough troops. There's quite a large debate already on the web, should young women also register for the draft? And should women be part of the draft? That debate has already begun.
Good. Yeah, Jerry.
I think we have to recognize that there are 2 narratives in American history. Unfortunately, right now, one of them seems more like an undercurrent, as it often does in times like these. But when you look at in the American tradition, there is, after all, a great resistance to imperial presidencies and concentrated power in the executive, as there are with any patience to long, drawn-out wars. American history does not show a great stomach for long, drawn-out wars. I think that's certainly, and the other factor here is the degree to which everything is going to be decimated, and it's certainly a large coalition as possible from all the program cuts that will clearly come, are already happening as a result of pursuing this simultaneous strategy of tax cuts and empire. The other thing that's new here, I think, is in the post-Vietnam period, more recent history, the emergence of the peace and justice movements in the United States connected to the global movements. As the New York Times reported last year in the protest in the run-up to the Iraq War, public opinion is called the new superpower. Based upon those simultaneous demonstrations that were held around the world because of the use of the new technologies of information and communication that have created the globalization from below that we saw at Seattle that actually resist the neoliberal side of the, sounds confusing, of the neoconservative doctrine. And every time the international financial institutions meet anywhere in the world, there's a large contingent of people, including Americans. So I think this is quite important, and that we have to keep in mind here, recognizing the dialectic between these two narratives.
Yes, this will be the final question. Brief, please.
Quick.
Yeah.
I'll hold it.
You can pay the bill to the law
thanks.
school. Yeah.
By the way, just a quick point. There's now one of these neoconservative groups going after labor studies and the Institute for Labor Relations here at Cal and Institute for Labor and Employment. They actually specifically mention them. So that's something to be apprised of. When someone said about, well, there's likelihood of something happening before the election, besides the horrible possibility of a terrorist attack, the other thing is Bush, if he's not winning there, why not raise the stakes and encourage Sharon to go after the Syrians, or the U.S. and the Israelis go after the Syrians, and sort of in the shadow of that, Sharon can raise havoc, in the West Bank and Gaza. Okay, so I want to know if that is if somebody thinks that's a possibility. And then the second... So that's one question. Yeah. Okay, so that'll be it. All right.
Okay, so the question really is, how far can the relationship between the Bush administration and Sharon go and actually achieve either Israel's goals or the United States's?
Well, I mean, how can it go much beyond what it is now? It's difficult to imagine. But I think it'd be crazy to use the Israelis or even encourage them to invade an Arab country. That would just make the whole situation explosive. I mean, if anything was determined to increase terror attacks, that single act would do it. So I don't think they're necessarily going to go down that particular route. And the other thing which has to be understood is that there is now a new wave of opposition inside Israel itself, that Avraham Burg, former chairman of the Knesset, one of the founding fathers of Israel, made a very strong statement, which I don't think was published in the United States, but it was certainly published in every European newspaper, in which he appealed to the leaders of Israel and said, come to your senses. What we are doing to the Palestinians is something impermissible and unforgivable. And he went even beyond that and said, when you reduce them to living in such conditions as they do, why are you surprised when they come and attack us? In other words, what he was saying is that when the difference between life and death is not so important because your everyday life is awful, people are prepared to sacrifice themselves. Now, this was an incredibly important statement from a senior Israeli. And of course, he was denounced in the Israeli press and in the United States even on some radio stations for saying that. But the fact that he said it is a very important indication of the growing nervousness within Israel itself. And some secret negotiations have begun done between Israeli oppositionists and Palestinians to try and have a serious two-state solution. Whether they come to anything, we will see. But, you know, one has to see the picture as a whole. And in this situation, given the crisis in Palestine, for Israel to be encouraged to do something else elsewhere in the Arab world would be crazy. It really would be crazy. There's no other way to describe it.
And one should add that there is something called the Geneva Accords, which was negotiated just in the last, well, it's been over a long period of negotiation, which has been announced or will be announced, signed by Palestinian and Israeli delegations not affiliated with their governments, and attached to a petition campaign, which is now circulating on the internet, to support that accord for a two-state solution on the one hand, but also for the UN and the United States to provide funds for the settlers to return to Israel. So it's a kind, you know, the settlers should go home to Israel and get out of the settlements. So that initiative is taking place. Well, I think we've had a very, you know, informative and useful exchange. I want to thank our panelists. I want to again remind you to go to globetrotter.berkeley.edu, you know, after January, and we'll be announcing other events. Then finally, I want to say that books, the new book by Tariq Ali, which really gives a very sophisticated history of Iraq in the context of its relations with the West, is on sale out there, and he will sign the books between 9 and 9:30. So if you want a book, you can go out there and get it, and he'll be out there. Okay?